Ah, got to get this set up right. Of course, it happens that things go sideways right now. All right. Hey, everybody. Glad that you are joining us again for, I think I've got my microphone turned up just a bit too much. There we go. Anyway, we're just going to roll with it and see what happens at this point. I'm glad that you were joining us um, for another week in the Gospel of Matthew. Last week we took a look at the Transfiguration, and which is fun because this Sunday I'm preaching the Transfiguration. I definitely didn't line it up like that on purpose, but it saved me a little bit of prep work this week, so I'm not complaining. So last week we took a look at the Transfiguration, which is in many ways an answer to this question or these questions. What does it mean to say that Jesus is the Messiah? And that moment, the Transfiguration, for lots of different reasons, begins to shift the view of who Jesus is. Across the last couple of weeks, the last couple of chapters, Jesus has started doing something he wasn't doing before, which is talking about the role that suffering and sacrifice are going to play in his life and in his ministry. And the disciples have a hard time hearing it, which we talked about for lots of reasons. I talked about some of those reasons in the last few weeks. Today is a further explanation with some challenging words thrown into the middle and then some interesting verses thrown on the end that all speak to the nature of Jesus, messiahship, his messianic nature, and what that means for the disciples. It sort of cycles that question. Again, if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to read through the Gospel of Matthew beginning to end so that you can see some of these big picture themes and ideas that play in. But for this evening, we are in chapter 17, verses 14 through, I wrote 27, and now I'm double checking that that is correct. Yes, 14 through 27. So, if you would, you can either choose to grab your Bible and follow along or listen as I read. I'm going to break it down into a few sections as we go so we can talk about those segments and what role they play in the broader story. Verse 14 of chapter 17. At the foot of the mountain, so Jesus has been on the mountain with three of his disciples where he was transfigured. They come down. At the foot of the mountain, a large crowd was waiting for them. A man came and knelt before Jesus and said, "Lord, have mercy on my son. He has seizures and suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't." Approaches Jesus. He doesn't call him teacher or rabbi. He calls him Lord. So there is in that phrase a recognition that there is something powerful, something that's a phrase of worship, whether it's and like earthly reverence that goes beyond a normal person to a king, or a phrase that is used to address God in worship. And this man approaches Jesus. Our translations say it a little bit differently. The one that I read, "Lord, have mercy on my son." But that really throws back to the Hebrew phrase, "Lord, save now." It's a cry out to God in the Old Testament, one that is used here directly to Jesus. So Matthew is saying something to us by, again, recounting that part of the story and making sure that we hear it in that way, because he's making messianic claims and having conversations with the disciples. We have a man who gets it, who isn't one of the disciples, but who comes to Jesus with that same, reverence and understanding that exists for God in the Old Testament. And he's coming fairly desperately. His son is suffering and he wants to see something done differently, but he came to Jesus' disciples and they couldn't help him. Assuming that Peter, James, and John are not the ones that were like, they were on the mountain with Jesus, so they're out of this. That means there are other disciples whom Jesus has given this ministry to in chapter 10 of healing and, freeing and restoring, and yet they were unable to do so. So here's something the disciples are supposed to be able to do, and yet they can't. So Jesus responds, and he responds, interestingly enough, by quoting both Moses and God from the Exodus. You faithless and corrupt people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Those are the quotes and references coming out of Exodus, where Jesus then speaks to the people the same way that Moses and God do in the time of the Exodus, this new people, this new community that is not coming along in the ways that they should. Jesus essentially refers to his disciples, his new community, his people who are not coming along in the way that Jesus would like them to, in the exact same way. Bring the boy to me, he said, and then Jesus rebuked the demon in the boy, and it left him, and from that moment on the boy was well. Afterwards, the disciples asked Jesus privately, why couldn't we cast out that demon? Translations include an additional verse here that makes a reference, something along the lines of, ones like this can only be cast out with prayer and fasting, or something along the lines. That's not in the oldest manuscripts and probably not original to Matthew's text, because it doesn't necessarily make sense with the rest of the story. What does is this comment about faith. You don't have enough faith, Jesus told them. And that's got to be hard to hear, but small faith, little faith, lacking faith is something that keeps coming up in Matthew's gospel. And maybe if you are somebody in Matthew's church community in the late first century who's struggling to have faith, it's a little bit encouraging to see that the disciples who now lead this growing church also struggled with that along the way. But the comments that come next can be difficult to sort if you haven't been paying attention to what Jesus means in Matthew's gospel when he says little faith. Because what he says is, you don't have enough faith. Your faith is too small. I tell you the truth, if you had faith even as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it would move. Nothing would be impossible. But we've already had comments from Jesus that the mustard seed is absolutely tiny. It is not big. And Jesus is not, I think, here talking about that their faith is so small that a mustard seed is giant in comparison to it. Instead, I think Jesus is doing something different here. Now, you can read it that way. It does. But again, I think taking the rest of Matthew into account, when Jesus talks of little faith in Matthew's gospel, he talks of a distracted faith. And so I think that little faith and mustard seed faith are faith of the exact same size. They're not big, they're not great. But one is distracted and divided, and the other one is set to grow. One is a seed, and one is falling apart, is moving in a multitude of directions. And the disciples have already shown themselves to be people of a distracted and divided faith. They are themselves distracted and divided. In fact, in the verse that we will look at next week, they're back to arguing about who's going to be greatest in Jesus' coming earthly kingdom. Again, showing that they're still wrestling with that question, one that we will continue to talk about in the coming weeks. So you have this tension between what the disciples think they're doing and what Jesus wants them to do, what they should be doing. And when they become fearful, when they become concerned, when they get distracted, the faith that should be setting their course goes by the wayside, while it is they themselves who end up setting the course. And I realize, as I'm saying this, that I actually wanted to share with you more about that, written directly by one of the Dr. Long, one of the guys that I was reading as I was getting ready for class this week. And so I'm actually going to step out of frame for a second and grab a book because I think he says it really well. So let me do that real quick. Reach over here. There we go. And make sure I get this right. Here we go. But mustard seed has already been described as the smallest of all seeds. So how is it that a mustard seed-sized faith can serve as a remedy for little faith? The answer lies in the difference between little faith and faith the size of a mustard seed. Both are small, but in different ways. Little faith is small in that it's lost its confidence in God's promise and power. Little faith sees the demons very clearly, but loses sight of God's saving purpose. Little faith is strong in the morning, setting out to show compassion to the poor, exercise mercy to the sick, stand for justice for the oppressed, and bring peace to places of strife. By the end of the day, though, spirits have sagged and knees have buckled. The poor are too many, disease always seems to have the last word. Trips to the cemetery are too frequent, the unjust are too strong, and the roots of evil too deeply entrenched. The gospel appears too little to go on, disciples are too few to make a difference, and trying to follow Jesus in this kind of world begins to seem like bailing out the ocean with a leaky bucket. Little faith moves from distraction to despair and finally to defeat. The world is the way it is, and that's it. Mustard seed faith is small also, but in a different way. Like little faith, it knows that it is always surrounded by troubles of great size, but it rests its hope on the ultimate victory of God. Like a mustard seed, this kind of faith looks puny when planted in the soil of a troubled earth, but the gardener knows that the tiny seed, by God's providence, will eventually grow into a great shrub. Mustard seed faith is the faith that, even though compassion and mercy seem overwhelmed by the immense cruelty in the world, what is done in Christ's name really counts, and that God's saving purposes will ultimately prevail over all that opposes it. I think Dr. Long nails it. And I think his words are incredibly applicable in our world for those moments where what we see troubles us and distracts us in a way that prevents or discourages our faith from growing, our faith from engaging, our faith from involving itself in the world that is around us. And again, all of this comes back to a question of what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah, because if their hopes and ours are set on a Jesus who sets the world right, makes everything the way ultimately that we want it to be, though we'll pin it on God, then seeing all of the stuff that has been left undone feels insurmountable. Seeing all of the challenges, and especially the ways in which those evils, whether it's illness or anything, triumph, can leave us feeling discouraged. What Jesus is doing, though, as a Messiah, is not setting the world a certain way. It's setting a way for followers to live with the goal, the hope that disciples who live as Jesus lived will ultimately bring about the goodness of God in the world in big and small ways. So we have that, and then we have a really interesting passage that has everything to do with Jesus' freedom and what he's doing with it, and that says something for us. This is a passage that I think people have struggled to know what to do with for a long time, added to the fact that it talks about taxation, our favorite of subjects, and it again just adds some layer of confusion and wondering for people who read it and go, what do I do with that? Verses 24 through 27 give us this. Upon their arrival in Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" That's a loaded question in the first century for lots of reasons. The pattern for paying the temple tax comes from Deuteronomy. It's a half shekel tax on all men 20 years of age or older. That is um, it's about atonement and also upkeep. It's a twofer. And by the first century, that had become, I think, all males 19 and older paying a 2 shekel tax because ancient world inflation. Um, and not everyone chose to pay it. People would try to find ways out of it. Um, and there were all sorts of ways you could get out of it. Turns out even ancient people didn't like taxes. And yet, some not only chose to pay it, but in this case, we get a story where Jesus essentially is about to explain to Peter why they don't have to pay it, and then why they should choose to, which I think is mind-blowing to people who are constantly trying to figure out how to pay as little as possible. But it's a lot about what it means to be the Messiah, because it's going to involve giving even when he doesn't have to, and giving beyond what is necessary. So here's how this passage goes. Peter responds, yes, he pays the temple tax. Then he goes into the house, but before he had a chance to speak, Jesus asked him, what do you think, Peter? Do kings tax their own people or the people that they've conquered? They tax the people they've conquered, Peter replied. Well then, Jesus said, the citizens are free. This is not a great translation of this passage that I'm reading because people have always taxed their citizens. Instead, this is more about children. Own people can also be translated children, and kings don't usually tax their actual children in the ancient world. They don't tax their family, they tax everybody else. And so here's Jesus as the Son of God, creating this community, the children of God. And Peter responds, they don't tax their children, they tax other people. And then Jesus responds, well then, the citizens are free, which is essentially Jesus exclaiming to Peter and the others who are hearing that they don't have to pay that tax. However, we don't want to offend them, so go down to the lake and go fishing. Open the mouth of the first fish you catch, and in it you will find a large silver coin. Take it and pay the tax for both of us. So there is, in those verses, this implied nature of the Messiah, which is a freedom to give. I understand that that's a strange way to read a strange passage. But Jesus essentially says, we don't have to, but we're gonna. Which is, I think, in a lot of ways, true about what Jesus is going to do on the cross. There's a moment in the garden, one that you will hear me reference often, where Jesus genuinely asks for another option. He recognizes that what is coming is not what he wants, and that there are other options available. We see that in temptations and in conversation. Like, Jesus can choose other paths. There is free will. But instead, he chooses to sacrifice. He chooses to give, not because he's going to get anything out of it. It costs him something, but because of what it does for others. So again, a small snapshot of a few strange verses that say a lot about what it means to be the Messiah, the way that Jesus is the Messiah. I think it's easy for the followers to get caught up in this notion of an earthly kingdom, an earthly power in an earthly realm. It is what many in the Jewish community have been hoping for from a Messiah for a very long time. And those hopes, dreams, and expectations get passed down generation to generation. And Jesus is having to show and teach and lead his disciples to understand that just because they think of the Messiah as a certain way does not mean that. Part of the transfiguration is a question of whether or not we can see Jesus differently than we have seen him. The disciples, the answer is very temporarily yes. They saw him changed. But do they see the changing that he is doing to their expectations, their wants, needs, desire, or wants and desires? And I think that's a good question for us to wrestle with. If Jesus ends up looking a lot like what we want, then maybe we're casting Jesus in our own image. If Jesus doesn't challenge us, then we have created an idol of our idea of Jesus that's very comfortable. Instead, we need to see all the ways in which who Jesus is and what Jesus does push back against what we as people often want, and how that leads us to something that isn't divided or distracted, but has room to grow into the type of faith that God has called us to. All right, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there. I love every time Jesus' disciples start arguing over who's greatest in the kingdom. I love every time we can put ourselves in the midst of passages and recognize our own fallibility. Next week is one of those. Again, if you've not done so already, please read through Matthew's Gospel beginning to end. I think it helps bring out all of these questions and themes just a little bit better. All right, I will see you next week.